This is History Lunch Break. My name is Glenn Perkins with the Greensboro History Museum, and we're thrilled to be bringing you our special Juneteenth program as part of this amazing celebration commemoration of online programming happening all day across the city of Greensboro. There's fantastic programs coming to you from Greensboro Public Library, from Parks and Recreation and Creative Greensboro, as well as from us, the Greensboro History Museum. And because it's Juneteenth, it's really important, we thought, to talk about voting, because it's such a critical part of the emancipation story, that big, long narrative of the Black American experience. And this story of voting rights has been such a critical moment and a critical place where things come together around that story of struggles for equality and freedom and equal representation within our country. We just recently, today's History Lunch Break is also part of the museum's Project Democracy 2020 initiative, which explores American democracy through exhibitions and public programs and innovative community connections. So we're grateful because Project Democracy 2020 is made possible in part by funding from the North Carolina Humanities Council, a statewide nonprofit and affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we've got some other major sponsors for Project Democracy, including the Tannenbaum Sternberger Foundation, Wells Fargo, the O. Henry Hotel, and Fox Rothschild LLP. The Project Democracy started with the visit of the Smithsonian Traveling Exhibition, American Democracy, A Great Leap of Faith. And last week, we had a live webcast with Barbara Clark Smith, one of the original co-curators of this show. And she shared her reflections on democracy with us. And you can check out a recording of the program on the museum's YouTube page or right on greensborohistory.org/democracy. One of Barbara's main points was that voting rights in America are often taught as this history of progress. You know, you move from removing property requirements in the 1820s to enfranchising formerly enslaved African Americans with the 15th Amendment in 1870. You get women granted suffrage 50 years later with the 19th Amendment. And then the reduction of the voting age to age 18 with the 26th Amendment. So, you know, this sort of history of progress. But Barbara pointed out that at the same time, there's an equally weighty history of pushback against those developments. Poll taxes, literacy tests, the fight against the Equal Rights Amendment, gerrymandering, voter suppression, voter ID laws, and all these things. And they all come together to really change the way that we see our history in terms of voting rights. So today we'll be talking about voting rights in North Carolina in particular, and I'm so thrilled to be able to introduce my first guest here. Professor Irving Joyner is professor of law at NC Central University in Durham, and he's also chair of the North Carolina NAACP Legal Redress Committee and its legal counsel. So welcome to you, Professor Joyner.
Well, thank you, Glenn, for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about this exciting topic.
Well, and it's exciting and again important. So, and I'm glad because you're such an expert on this. And I think it's interesting. I think we should look back because you point out that really the history of disenfranchisement in North Carolina goes all the way back to 1835. Yes,
prior to 1835, and contrary to popular opinion or knowledge, African Americans or Africans at that time could vote and did vote in North Carolina. North Carolina was one of several states in which Africans, free Africans could vote. It was the only state in the South that allowed for free Africans to vote. And there was a huge population of free Africans here in North Carolina, particularly in the eastern part of the state. And they were actively involved in the political effort because they were landowners and property owners and business owners here in the state, even though there were slaves also in the state.
So there's an effort by the legislature to deprive those free blacks of their voting rights in 1835. And so that's going to, of course, reduce everybody to sort of all black men to the same level of not being able to vote. And of course, that changes again after the Civil War. And it actually in 1868, the North Carolina Constitutional Convention makes it possible for black men all of a sudden to be able to be political participants. Can you tell us a little about the Reconstruction era and sort of some of the big developments during that time?
Well, led by people like Bishop John Walker Hood, Abraham Galloway, and others, after the Civil War, the newly enfranchised Africans came together and put together a black convention in which they made demands on the state as to the level of participation in the affairs of the state that those newly emancipated Africans wanted to have. And among those things was the right to vote. And knowing what had happened in 1835, they were adamant about including in the North Carolina Constitution the right for all people to vote, irrespective of their race. And so that was one of the big demands that became a part of the North Carolina Constitution. The Constitutional Committee that drafted the initial Constitution included a large number of African Americans, and indeed in the first legislature that was convened in North Carolina after the Civil War, 17 African Americans by this time were elected to serve in that General Assembly, and those folks enjoyed widespread and robust political participation up until 1898. But during the Reconstruction era, the newly enfranchised African Americans were actively involved in the process, voting typically at 90 to 95% of the eligibility that they had in the state during that time.
That's really remarkable. It's just, I think, a part of our state story that's often lost, that we don't really understand or remember the way that Black political participation was so critical to the world of the state at that time. Of course, as you mentioned, 1898, things really began to change. There's a rabid white supremacist movement, and of course, we look to the coup in Wilmington as really a moment where things transformed tremendously.
Yeah, well, you're talking about basically 30 years, 35 years of participation by African Americans, and they had a loud voice and active participation. Those persons who were a part of the Confederacy were still around. And throughout this period, they were actively engaged in trying to regain power in the state, and they employed every measure imaginable to undermine the ability and the aspirations of African Americans to participate in the franchise, which ended up November 10th, 1898, with the political and military overthrow of a duly elected city council in Wilmington, where the Confederates, the Red Shirts, the Ku Klux Klan, under the directions and with the cooperation of the Democratic Party here in this state, literally marched into Wilmington and forcibly overthrew that government and installed an all-white government in their stead. The leaders at that time were sent out of town. They were placed on trains and driven out of the state and told never to return. And ironically, 1898 spells the end of African-American participation in the political process leading up to 1900, when you had the constitutional and statutory enactments which took away from African-Americans the right to vote, which was then supported by military and terroristic activities by whites to intimidate the African-Americans who even demonstrated a desire to participate in the political franchise.
Yeah, all of a sudden it's a new century, and it's just a totally transformed place for Black North Carolinians at the time. It's really something that I think we have to look back to and recognize. And even now, I mean, you see just this past week the statue of Josephus Daniels in Raleigh coming down. The editor of the Raleigh News and the Raleigh paper at the time, a strong advocate for the white supremacists. So I think that there is this sort of part of this reckoning that's going on right now. If you're just joining,
Daniels was an active participant in the overthrow of the government in 1898. Used the newspaper to inflame white sentiments against African Americans and to support this concept that military force or terroristic force should be used to drive African Americans from the polls and to keep them from voting. So it was a good omen to see that the removal of the Daniels statute occurred. And to their credit, it was the Daniels family that orchestrated the removal of his statute from Nash Square, and it showed a recognition on their part that they deemed his place in modern day history as being something that ought to be covered up and moved out of the way and not celebrated within the city of Raleigh.
I think, yeah, and it's certainly important to see those connections, as you point out, between the legal restrictions on voting for Black North Carolinians at the time and those sort of extra legal ways, propaganda in the press, terroristic organizations, and all sorts of other devices of white supremacy that really affected voting rights for the Black community.
Yes.
In case you're just joining us, this is History Lunch Break. My name is Glenn Perkins, and my guest here is Irv Joyner from NC Central School of Law. And we're talking a little bit about the history of voting rights in North Carolina. So the Jim Crow era is really a crushing one for Black political participation in North Carolina. As we move into the 1950s, though, things begin to change a little bit.
Yeah, I guess after roughly 45 years or so, African Americans were able to hit some, I guess, significant steps toward political participation. And it actually began with the successful election of Reverend Kenneth Williams in 1947 to the city council in Winston-Salem, not Wilmington, well, Winston-Salem, where for the first time in Southern history, you had an African American in a political district running against a white opponent, and the African American won. So Kenneth Williams became the first African American to be elected to an office in North Carolina after 1900. And then that slowly created a dribble of other African Americans around the state who ran for and won in local offices in various campaigns. There in Greensboro, you had Dr. Hampton, Dr. William Hampton, who was elected in 1951. But from 1947 up until the 60s, county commissioner here, city council member there, town council member, where there were significant African Americans in the population, were able to begin to break the exclusion that existed and really modeled themselves after the Durham Committee on the Affairs of Black People that was very active politically within the city of Durham and wielded significant influence in the political process, even though they were in the midst of the Jim Crow segregation that was occurring during that time, which then led us up to 1965 and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was passed by Congress.
And it's so interesting to me too that it's the break on that white supremacy within political power starts at the local level. So you've got these individual candidates sort of chipping away, and you know that there's organizing structures behind them who are really, as you mentioned in Durham, who are really helping move this this progress forward to reobtaining that equity and regaining the promise that the 15th Amendment had said that the country would not discriminate on the basis of race. But of course, it did take the Voting Rights Act in 1965 to really reinforce and to give the federal government some powers in order to make the 15th Amendment work. Can you tell us a little bit about that time in North Carolina?
Well, in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, roughly 14% of the African American population was registered to vote, a paltry number, and that was particularly significant in the eastern part of the state. And in the 1965 Voting Rights Act, carved out as a protected jurisdiction was 40 counties in the eastern part of the state, in which the Voting Rights Act gave particular attention to because of its history of excluding and suppressing the vote and registration opportunity for African Americans. So we had 40 counties in North Carolina that were covered under the Voting Rights Act, as well as other states in the South. So you kind of had a mix in this state of those jurisdictions covered under what is called the pre-clearance plan, and those other counties that were not under the pre-clearance plan. So in Forsyth County and Guilford County, Durham County, they were not a part of the covered jurisdictions. Instead, the eastern part of the state was basically covered under the 65 Voting Rights Act. And that was a very important legal breakthrough. But it was really not until around 1980s that those African Americans led by Henry Fry, another Greensboro native or resident, who pushed the legislature to the point of enacting legislation that became friendly to the opportunity for African Americans to register and vote. So you had Mickey Mishaw out of Durham, you had Joy Johnson out of Robeson County, and of course Judge Fry from Guilford County, Richard Irving out of Winston-Salem, and others who began to push the legislature. And slowly we got to the point that we ended up with Dan Blue in 1990 being elected as Speaker of the House, the first African American to be elected as a Speaker of the House in the history of the South, or the modern South, as I might say. And then that led to other kinds of legislation that was friendly to the registration of African Americans, and from there we began to roll. But the pioneers in this effort has to be Henry Fry, Mickey Mashaw, George Johnson, and others who led the campaign to push for the development of a new and different Democratic Party that was more amenable to the support of the African American community.
Now you mentioned the pre-clearance part of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and of course, and that's what the 2013 decision in Shelby County versus Holder overturned. Is that right?
That's right. The Shelby County versus Holder decision basically said that the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. The pre-clearance provision was very important in being able to attack efforts by legislators or by local officials to undermine and make it more difficult for African Americans to register and vote. And before any change in the voting process could become effective, you had to clear it through the Justice Department, and that allowed us to regularly attack those provisions. The Shelby versus Holder decision came along, and that took away that protection. And at the same time that the North Carolina General Assembly, which was now under the control of the Republican Party, began a widespread assault on the modern day and present day right of African Americans to vote by trying to rid itself of the early voting provisions, instituting a voter ID requirement that would have a very detrimental impact on the ability of African Americans to vote. And that led to a number of lawsuits, both in federal court and in state court. And I'm really proud to say that, led by the North Carolina NAACP, Forward Justice, and other groups and organizations in the state, every suit against the General Assembly designed to take away those rights that we had, we were able to prevail in court. And we continue in court today, fighting efforts by this North Carolina General Assembly to undermine the ability and opportunities for African Americans to vote. One of the key things that we have is high motivation within our community. People are aware of what's going on, and they have responded. And in 2008 was the first time in thing occurred. So our community is much more politically motivated and aware today, and so we are proud of the movement that we've made in the state, but there is so much more that needs to be done to move us forward and to protect against the gains that we've been able to achieve.
And I think this brings us is a great point to bring us to invite in our other two guests who are really here to talk about local efforts to educate and to provide access to the polls, especially for the Black communities and minority communities and communities that have been sort of traditionally marginalized within the voting landscape. So I'm really excited here to have my colleague Danielle Pritchett, who is from the Greensboro Public Library, where she is the North Carolina History and Government Documents Librarian. And she's been working with Leila Lewis, who's our other guest today, who's the Piedmont Triad Organizing Director for You Can Vote, which is an organization working to empower all North Carolina citizens to successfully cast their ballots. So welcome, Danielle and Leila. Can you guys talk a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing to make sure that the voters have access to the polls here in Greensboro?
Well, I wish we had the ability to physically get our patrons to the polls, but we can't do that. So we wanted to focus on the education front. And, you know, Glenn, as part of the library's mission statement, we want to provide free and equal access to information for all members of the community. And we know that historically, a lot of minority communities were not able to get that same access to information, especially when it comes to voting and information. So Leila and I, we decided to work together to create a series of voter registration drives and information sessions. And we wanted to focus on our library branches that serve those members of the community, the minority and the multicultural community. So we hosted drives here at Central, Glenwood, and we were hoping to get to Vance Chavis before the pandemic, but hopefully we can continue that in the future. So we really wanted to focus on promoting education to those areas of Greensboro.
Yeah, and I think that obviously the pandemic is a huge question right now. So Leila, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you in particular in your organization are strategizing around ensuring that people can reach the polls, given this whole new sort of COVID world that we're all living in right now.
Yeah, so we have definitely been focusing a lot on how to get the information, our voter education information, out to people. In addition to whether or not you're eligible to register and vote, where to vote, how to do so, whether it's by mail or in person. Also making sure people have an understanding of who's on the ballot, the responsibilities of political offices. And so we have really upped our phone banking and text banking. We have an awesome team of college students working in a fellowship program this summer, and we're already rolling out Get Out the Vote efforts that's focusing on contacting people, whether it be by phone or text, to say, hey, are you registered? Do you know how to check that? Do you know that you can register online now through the DMV? Have you requested your absentee ballot yet? Well, let's get that started because you can actually do that now. Our goal is to stay in touch with voters from now until the election. Typically, Get Out the Vote efforts start a little later in the year around the fall, but we figure because people are going to need a lot more reminders as well as a little more education information around the options around voting by mail, the absentee ballot process, we thought that it was important to get that started and then continue to communicate and reach out to those voters through the year.
Yeah, there's so many complications right now. I do want to invite any of our viewers right now on the Zoom. If you have a question, go ahead and type it into the Q&A or into the chat. I'll be happy to share it with our talented and wise panel of guests right here. Leila, what do you feel like right now are some of the really big challenges for communities, especially Black communities here in Greensboro, for accessing the ballot?
So accessing the ballot, I think that what we hear from the community a lot, especially with newer voters, is not being familiar with who they're voting for. So again, the what's on the ballot is a tricky place for some voters. And without confidence in that, we find that some voters might not be as excited about taking advantage of this right that they have. So I do like to personally focus on our voter education piece, making sure people understand that our local politics that happen every 2 years at election season are important. They do touch their lives on a day-to-day basis, which is why it's important to vote every election instead of every 4 years. We're really waiting to find out how our county board of elections specifically is going to be able to attack the social distancing requirements that we anticipate being in place. And with that, we really want to make sure that people start learning about the absentee ballot process, understanding what that entails, that they have the right to request that now, and requesting that ballot does not mean that they can't go vote in person later. It gives them options in the event that something catastrophic happens later in the year. We find that that process is very new for people. If they've gone and voted, typically they go vote at the polls, early voting or on election day. So being able to have those conversations with folks now, understanding that they need to actually submit that request form themselves. And then when they get their ballot, understanding that they will need someone to witness them completing their ballot and signing the ballot to say, I did witness that this voter is who they say they are, and they are the one who cast this ballot, and then mailing that in themselves. So those are the most specific things that I've found voters need to be reminded of and just be aware of as they're going through this process, not to just to ensure that it's something that they're looking out for, because what we don't want is for people to be excited about being able to participate in this process and then later find out that one step kept them from actually having their voice heard in our
Mhm.
We have a question here and about from Michelle, who says that she understands how limits to absentee and early voting can impede access, since minority communities are more likely to have limited access to transportation or work schedules that don't allow them to get to polls. But she's wondering about voter ID requirements and how those impede fair access. She says if you don't drive, you can still get a free state issued ID card. Maybe you guys could address that, and certainly the historical, some of the historical connections to the voter ID question. And again, and remind us as well sort of what the status of that voter ID is going into this election, because I know it's been back and forth.
Well, let me see if I can do it quickly. One is that there is an injunction that is in place right now, both from the federal court and from the state court, which prevents the state from imposing the voter ID requirement. The debilitating impact of the voter ID requirement flow from the fact that the underlying documentation that a person needs to be able to get a state issued photo ID was utilized or taken away from African Americans during Jim Crow era. A lot of people, for instance, in North Carolina, are born without a birth certificate. And a birth certificate is a critical document that you need to be able to obtain a driver's license or some type of photo, state-sponsored photo ID. And because of the discrimination that occurred in North Carolina, where African-American children were born at home rather than in hospitals or by midwives and other methods, birth certificates were not obtainable in many of those situations. And there are literally thousands of people in North Carolina who don't have these underlying documents because of the requirements of Jim Crow, but because Jim Crow prevented them from having the documents that are now needed to be able to obtain. And then there are other reasons as well that many African Americans don't have a state-sponsored photo ID and cannot get one. So it is the discriminatory impact is more noticeable among African Americans and certainly among Latinos in this state than it is with whites.
I would like to add, because of the current injunction preventing a photo ID being required at the polls, even the Board of Elections in the counties are no longer printing those free IDs, because no one should be asked for their ID when they go to the polls. So the Board of Elections no longer actually provides those IDs for the purpose of voting.
One other thing that's been that's been changing obviously a good bit is voting districts and legislative districts. We've had historic gerrymandering in the state that I think everybody would agree with, and of course the federal decision noted that some of that gerrymandering was racial gerrymandering. So what are the sort of, where are we at in terms of legislative districts in North Carolina right now? How easy is it going to be for those of us who are used to voting in a certain district to find out what our new district or who our new candidates are?
Well, that's going to be a continuing issue that people have. But we were successful in challenging the gerrymandering that had occurred, which stacked and packed African Americans into certain political districts, and then even divided districts where African Americans live. Case in point is A&T. Where the legislators basically split that campus and put it into two separate districts in a way that you would undermine the impact of the African American vote and voice in a particular district. That has now been repaired, and that should allow for greater voice by people in it. But that's just one example of what this gerrymandering did and what we were able to do to prevent that from continuing.
And I also want to add that we really try to get our patrons to check their status. You can do it free online. You can do it on You Can Vote's website. And so I always tell people, even though you were registered, it's good to check on that registration, and it tells you what district or the area you need to go to vote. So we don't want anyone to show up at the wrong poll on election day. So we really want to get that information out there as far as checking the status of your registration.
And that also makes sure that you've not been purged.
Right.
Because periodically the county boards and purge people from the voting rolls. And so checking is one way to make sure, and Danielle's point is spot on, that we need to be very active and aggressive in ensuring that we are still on the rolls.
Mm-hmm.
We got a question from our own education curator, Rodney Dawson, via our Facebook live stream. And he wants to know whether false rumors spread through the internet or other social media sites will affect minority turnout. For instance, he's heard the mail-in ballots are more easily susceptible to fraudulent activity, as an example of one of those rumors, that's coming around. What do you guys sense, and is there an important part of voter education that can ensure that people know what's correct about the voting situation?
Well, You Can Vote has found that best practice for voter education and voter turnout is to have conversations with voters one-on-one. So that has allowed for us to get to the root of some misconceptions. It allowed, because we're nonpartisan, it allows for people the comfort to ask questions like, is it true that da da da? And then we are able to share what we know to be true and accurate. We try to err on the side of statistics when possible, but definitely being able to zero in on some of those things whenever possible. And we also do I wouldn't say aggressive social media campaigns, but social media campaigns that are targeted to things that we are keeping track of in terms of the information that's being disseminated, and making sure that this information is getting out to all communities as far and wide as possible. Additionally, relational organizing is something that we started rolling out as a program almost immediately when we started self-isolation, which is really focusing on essentially each one teach one. So our volunteers first learned about the changing laws, the information, and then encouraging them to spread into their social networks, as opposed to the idea of us coming to do a community event, them actually talking to their family and friends to make sure their family and friends have information, know where to go to find information, and kind of going from there. So that some of these things can at least be corrected when we see it.
One of our Zoom watchers, Lisa, wants to know how she can get involved with ensuring that people are registered to vote.
Well, youcanvote.org is a website chock full of information specific to North Carolina voting rights, voting laws, and where you can also pledge to vote, which will keep you informed about our changing laws, especially with COVID-19. Some things must change through legislation in order to kind of proceed with general election. And you can also sign up to vote, sign up to volunteer, which will keep you up to date on the different opportunities that'll be available.
Let me just add to what Leila has said. I think it's very important. But you wherever you are, one point that you can do is to ensure that you have 100% turnout from your family, those that are in the home, and at the family reunion next week and week after next, and during this next month, you should engage in discussion with everyone there about it. But you can make sure that you have 100% participation at your church, and then 100% participation in your neighborhood. So you don't have to necessarily join up with an organization to do it, although joining with an organization will enhance your ability to be impactful in the community that you're in. But if you can just ensure that those people around you are going out to vote, particularly your children, your spouses, your siblings and cousins, and you have a million cousins that's out there who need to vote. And if you can mobilize them, educate them, and direct them, then you will have done a lot. And You Can Vote is one opportunity that you have to hook up with outreach to expand the impact that you can have.
And you can also send people to the library. Libraries are trusted pillars of the community. We have voter registration forms available at all of our branches. You Can Vote has trained me on how to help people fill out the registration forms. If they need that extra assistance, they can come see me here at Central. They can download the forms themselves from home. They can turn them into any of our library branches. The library managers will bring the forms over to me or send them over to me, and then Leila and I will make sure it gets to the Board of Elections. So there's just another avenue that patrons in the community can use to get registered to vote.
There's tons of great resources. I have a few to put into the chat that Leila had sent along, and I know that Danielle has some information as well on the Greensboro Public Library website on the government page. We've got some resources as well on the Greensboro History Museum's democracy page, both about the history of democracy, some great resources and inspiring videos from the Smithsonian, talking about how youth are critical to bringing out the vote and making change in the country. So there's really some tremendous resources. Before we go, I just want to ask you guys to share really quickly sort of what continues to inspire you to promote this both knowledge of the history of voting rights in our state and our community, and working to ensure that people can cast their votes fairly.
It's just the power to change. If you want change, that's the way to go about it. Just go into those polls, getting your vote in.
And from my end, the events of the last couple of weeks following the death of George Floyd and the literally hundreds of others, African Americans who have been killed by the police, it ought to be ample motivation for people to get out and participate in the vote, because it is the result of that determines what will happen and whether we will have change within our police operations and other things that affect our lives on a daily basis. So we need to be motivated, and if not now, when?
I've been so encouraged by our high school students here in Greensboro and Guilford County who have checked the registration. I've watched them check to find out they registered, called their mom, looked up their mom and said, hey, you're not registered, and working with their friends to do the same in a classroom setting. That's been the most encouraging, and being able to see those students and talk to them after they voted for the first time was really an honor for me.
I think you guys summed it up so well. It's really so critically important just to the future of our whole country. All of us going forward together and trying to make this country what it set out intended to be, in terms of a place of equality and freedom for all. It's been an honor having all three of you here on History Lunch Break today. Really great conversation, I think, for Juneteenth, and really talking about the ways that emancipation continue going forward. So it's been wonderful again, and I hope folks will stay tuned for more Juneteenth programming from the city of Greensboro. Coming up, I know there's some great stuff from the public library at Creative Greensboro, some amazing arts programs, some fascinating stuff from the parks. We've got a couple of programs from the History Museum coming up, including Juneteenth Bingo at 4 o'clock, a look at Juneteenth celebrations, the history of Juneteenth celebrations in Greensboro with Dr. Arwen Smallwood from North Carolina A&T. He'll be spending some time with us. And all these programs will be recorded and available to stream later on. If you missed them live, you can check out more about Project Democracy 2020 at greensborohistory.org/democracy. Again, thank you to our guests today. It's been a wonderful conversation, and we look forward to seeing you again here soon at the museum. So for me, Glenn Perkins, thanks everybody for watching.